Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. This is Chapter 7 of Micronation, Virtual Children, from Amberlove's memoirs. There was no reason for me to be disgusted by the muffins. I guess I just felt that there was something wrong with them. But I honestly never felt that there was something wrong with the child who sold them to me. I'd like to take credit for what we found and did, believe me, but I can't. We had been traveling for 9 months. Darla kept trying to find cases for her husband, but he rejected them all in disgust. We tried investigating a few things here and there on the side, but Prow always did a horrible job at it. He claimed it was because I was a weak Watson. I don't understand why he had to take this frustration out on me. He was the one who sent Chester to prison. So there we sat inside of a bistro in Prague. I must admit there was something I loved about the name. It helped describe the wonderfully twisted streets and wonderfully twisted iron with its Gothic curlicues. That kind of thing was all over Europe, but somehow it became more alive because it was in a city like Prague. It just had a one-syllable name, and it came out in a wonderful way. Anyway, about the muffins. I think the best place to start is to explain the travel pods. Well, it isn't really that hard to understand. Travel pods have been growing like mad in various parts of the world, but not in the US. Basically, they're very sturdy, cheap, and user-friendly drones connected wirelessly to the internet. They allow someone from halfway across the world to visit a place they've never been with all the benefits of being there. You can see, hear, touch anything you could as long as you were really there and only pay a fraction of the cost of a plane ticket. You also don't need a hotel room. The pods were about the size of a small office trash can, with a small, flexible robotic arm. They had 4 wheels and a video screen that could show you the face of the person you were talking to. They also had a lot of cameras so that anyone using them from a distance could look around and see where they were in any direction. So when the child came selling me muffins, I was a bit surprised that they were using one of these drones. I mean, the cost of a normal muffin was more than the cost of a drone. It didn't make any sense to me. The muffins also looked pretty bad. In fact, the only real selling point was the fact that the child was extremely cute and adorable. She had black hair, brown eyes, and dimples. She didn't seem to be capable of guile. "Would you like to buy a muffin?" she asked. "No, thank you," I replied. "Are you sure you don't want to buy a muffin?" She seemed saddened by my refusal to buy the muffins. "I'm quite certain I don't want any." "It's for a really good cause. 10% of profits go towards fighting starvation." "It's proceeds." "What?" "The word is proceeds, not profits," I said. She giggled. "Oh, I didn't do too well on my vocabulary test last week." She was just too cute for words. I said, "Oh, all right, I'll buy a muffin." "Don't you dare buy a muffin from that little girl," Prow said in a bold voice from across the table. I said, "I'll buy a muffin from anyone I want to, thank you very much." It probably wasn't the nicest thing to say to one's employer, but I was annoyed. "That," Prow said, pointing at the travel pod, "is no ordinary child. That child is a genetically modified clone." "Huh?" the girl selling the muffin said. "Don't you me, you demonic manifestation," Prow said. "Who are you working for?" Darla had been silent up until now, but stood up. "Maybe we should pay our bill and leave, dear." Prow got up and began to shake the machine. "You hear me, brat? Who is your Fagin, your handler, someone who is minding your demonic bidding?" "I thought you didn't believe in that kind of thing," Darla said with a combination of amusement and annoyance. "I was speaking metaphorically," Prow said. That was it. I wasn't going to put up with this anymore. The child was on the verge of tears. I said, "I'll buy 40 muffins. How much are they?" $1 apiece, the child said in a voice that was half elation and half misery. "I'll pay for it," I said. Prow looked indignant. "What are you doing?" I ignored him and paid the child. She smiled and left the entire tray. Prow was beside himself and sputtering with rage. Darla couldn't help but giggle. I thanked the child as she left. Her travel pod did a cute little dodge to the left and then sped away. I ate the muffin. It was horrible. I didn't let Prow know that, though. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I saw the look of sympathy from Darla. The fact that I didn't offer her one was enough for her to know what it actually tasted like. She didn't want to encourage this kind of behavior in her husband either. After an act of supreme willpower, I managed to finish the muffin. Once I had eaten the last crumb while Prow sat there fuming, I finally asked him so casually, "So what was that fit about?" Prow said, "You're being unusually defiant today, Amberlove. Have you been reading Watson's stories again?" I smiled. "I thought I was supposed to be your Watson." Prow mumbled something along the lines of course, and changed the subject. He said, "Well, I think it's impossible for a child to actually be that cute." "Well," Darla said, "how do you know it was even a real child?" Prow scoffed. "Of course it was a real child. You could tell from the background noise." Darla chuckled. "I think you're underestimating the skill of some digital manipulators. I mean, it could have been a real child, but it didn't have to be. We have no real way of knowing." Prow smiled, getting an insane look in his eye that he gets when he decides to pursue a case. "I beg to differ, Darla. I beg to differ. All we have to do is chase this problem down to its origin." I said, "Didn't you have some kind of rule that someone had to hire us to take a case?" Prow paused a moment and shook his head. "Sometimes a puzzle should be solved for its own sake." There was a satisfied harumph as Prow sensed his temporary victory. Being as single-minded as he is, he immediately turned the conversation back to the child that had sold the muffins. "What details do either of you remember about the travel pod?" We sat and thought a moment. Now that I thought about it, aside from the child, I couldn't remember much of anything. That was weird, because I had a very good memory for detail. I remembered the child being very cute, and the fact that the muffins smelled very good, and that was it. "That is significant," Prow said, when I recounted these details to him. Darla's details weren't much better. She did remember that the travel pod moved away at roughly 15 miles per hour based on how fast it moved in relation to the other reference points around it. She shrugged. "I find it troubling myself. I should have been able to remember more." Mr. Prow nodded. "That is significant." "In what way?" I asked. "That," he answered, "will become apparent in time." I didn't know how to respond. Prow often muddled his way through these situations, but without Chester, he wasn't really good at it. It seemed that his intuition was inversely proportional to whoever he had as his Watson. He certainly didn't do any kind of detective work, despite the fact that he called himself one. It wasn't that facts were entirely irrelevant to him, since his intuition relied on having source material from which to draw, but no one was as good as Chester was at that. For anyone else, it seemed to take at least twice as long, sometimes longer. In fact, without a Watson, in many ways, Quiescence Prow was useless. So we spent a considerable amount of time wandering about the city, watching for travel pods. We saw several, red and orange striped ones, plain metallic gray ones, bright yellow ones, with antennas all draped with cloth banners that had various corporate logos. Eventually, we narrowed the possibilities to companies that used gray stripes. After asking around, we discovered that the name of the first company was Indirect Inc., and the name of the second company was Vandellovian Enterprises. There was some consideration for us to split up. Eventually, we decided that we all work better together. We were going to try Indirect Inc. when Darla asked, "Why don't we track down the travel pods selling muffins?" "Anyone could be selling muffins." Prow smiled and shook his head condescendingly. I knew Darla hated that. "Actually, that's just the thing. While the two of you were looking at the colors of the travel pods, I was looking at what they were carrying. About 1 in 5 of them had a tray of muffins on top that looked just like the one sold to Amberlove. Just as I suspected, they rented travel pods from over half a dozen companies to cover their tracks." Darla simply blinked her eyes flirtatiously and smiled at Prow. "So how do you narrow it down to those two companies?" I asked. Darla touched her nose and then smiled but had a weird look. I wondered why she wanted to keep it a secret. Mr. Prow sat and thought for a while and then considered the information. Finally, he said, "I think the travel pods have a symbiotic relationship with the clone children." Darla and I looked at each other. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked. "It means that the children are attempting to forge a mechano-symbiotic relationship with the machines in an attempt to find a host." Darla, to humor her husband, asked, "And why might that be?" "Because the children's genetic structure is breaking apart. I think that with mechanical bodies, they plan to take over the earth and make us mow our lawns." At that, Darla nodded politely and smiled at me. She winked. "All right, dear. And what do we do next to prove this theory?" Mr. Prow thought a moment and then said, "It is apparent to me that the people behind this are going to great lengths to hide their presence for us. But they seem to be quite intent on selling these muffins. Therefore, it seems logical that they would continue to do so tomorrow. I propose that we obtain one of these travel pods on our own, with a resident expert on tracking down internet traffic, and backtrace the call they make when they make the connection." I was quite surprised. It was actually a good suggestion, and he was right. We probably were wasting our time trying to chase them down after the fact. Anyone who was truly determined to hide their identity behind a dozen different firewalls and false leads could do so, but a live connection was a different thing altogether. Selling muffins was not generally considered dangerous to people, so whatever the person hiring these children was up to, they didn't know we were looking for them. Why did I take Mr. Prow's delusion seriously? Because as demented as they might have been, and as hamstrung as he might have been without Chester, he is still a great man. I have always admired him for his sheer determination to get to the bottom of an issue. He doesn't linger once he's proven wrong. He just instantly changes his mind and goes in a different direction. I know people that can hang on to something for years before they let it go. Heck, I love Chester, but he can carry a grudge forever. That's what got him into trouble in the first place. So we spent the better part of the morning all sitting around looking at the travel pod waiting for someone to hire it out. We weren't even sure if they would pick this city again, but around 10 a.m., a man in his early 50s sent us a visual email asking to rent a travel pod for his, quote, grandson, end quote. Darla ran a check on the man in the email and identified him as an actor who died a few years ago. It was a virtual mask. They were fairly routine, but very time-consuming to produce. Obviously, it was enough to get people to do business with him. We let the travel pod go and watched as it went to a nearby baker and ordered several muffins. What I didn't understand was, if they came from a bakery, why did they taste so bad? Mr. Prow was torn at first between following and tracing the travel pod and investigating the bakery. He chose to follow the travel pod. Sure enough, it began to sell the muffins for an exorbitantly inflated price. At first, I thought it might have been a clever money-making scheme, but then Darla explained the math to me. Renting the travel pod cost 5 times what they were selling the muffins for. And if that was the case, what were they up to? It was at that point that Darla asked, "Who exactly is supposed to be tracing this thing? I thought you were hiring someone." I looked at Darla. "I thought you were taking care of it," Darla smiled. "Do I look like a hacker?" "I'm sorry. Computer expert? Security expert?" Mr. Prow said. "Well, you're the one who researches everything." Darla smiled, both flattered and exasperated. "Look, I've got a lot of talents. That doesn't mean I can do everything." Mr. Prow raised his hands to his head and lowered them, sighing. "I suppose I should have asked." "Yes, you should have." Darla sounded quite happy with herself. "So we have a guy here who we know is doing something really fishy, and we have a connection to him, but not a way to track him?" I asked. Mr. Prow nodded. "Yes, that's pretty much it." "So what are we doing here? I mean, we were in Prague. We had already wasted most of the trip on really stupid things, and I had no intention of wasting it." There was a long pause, and eventually Mr. Prow said, "Apparently nothing." I nodded and took the rest of the day off to see the city. I found out that I loved Prague. The people were different and interesting. I couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but I enjoyed watching them and listening to them nonetheless. I love that word, nonetheless. It sounds so literary. I like people watching, particularly when I only understand the tones of their voices. There were 2 old men arguing in a street corner. One of them had a bundle of apples in one hand and the other had a pipe. Were they arguing about the pipe, the apples, or something else entirely? Was I right when I heard a pleasant tone of agreeing to disagree under what they were saying? Or was I losing that in the way they talked since I didn't know their language? I suppose I should have spent the day looking at the rest of the great art in the city, and there's certainly a lot of it. The buildings were beautiful, but to be honest, the greatest art the city could offer was the people. By the time we got back the next day, all the muffin sellers were gone. Prow was definitely not happy, but he didn't know what to do. We all stood around and looked forlornly at the rented travel pod. Finally, Darla had had enough. "What we need to do is track them in other cities." "Of course," Prow smiled and stood up immediately. "Why didn't I think of that? This is just a security precaution. They're moving to make sure no one gets suspicious and follows their trail." The harsh winter wind began to blow from the side of the lake. The plants that lined the edges seemed to shudder as if somehow they knew that in a few weeks they would be dead. I was glad the sun was out. It made me feel warm despite the fact that I wasn't wearing a jacket. Darla came to the rescue. "I'll check all the tourist traffic in the capitals of nearby nations to see if I can spot Uncle Fakey." "Who?" I asked. Darla smiled. "My private nickname for the actor that played the person used in the false request." "Oh." Mr. Prow began to pace while Darla searched through her archives for some kind of guide to match what she was looking for. Once she found a few profile clues, she proceeded to configure her search engine tools to scan relevant tourist sites. It took about 14 minutes. Darla found the new muffin mongers in Paris. We had been to Paris before, but not very long. Mr. Prow had been very offended by the attitude of a cab driver and cursed all Parisians and their lineage ever after. We had spent a lot more time in Avignon. Darla and I were looking forward to it. We began to call our little escapade the Great Muffin Caper, but Mr. Prow would have none of it. He insisted that only a Watson could name a case, and that neither of us were proper Watsons. I had tried asking Darla about his past, but she hadn't told me much. His fixation with Sherlock Holmes, she says, comes from an extreme boredom with reality and a very troubled relationship with his older brother, Agnew. I could understand his boredom with reality, since Mr. Prow's world certainly seemed a great deal more interesting than our own, but the situation with his brother confounded me a bit. Mycroft, Darla had explained, as if that was sufficient unto itself. I really hate to be rude, and I really don't like to appear stupid, so I didn't say anything else. There are those that say there are no stupid questions, but I beg to differ. I have been asked more than a few questions that have caused everyone in the room to stare at me as if I were some kind of idiot. I don't like that feeling. So I waited a few days until I could not stand it any longer. For you see, when Darla had said Mycroft, I thought she said Microsoft. When I tried to research it on Wikipedia, it still made no sense. Then I tried an article on Sherlock Holmes and learned who Mycroft was. Apparently, Sherlock Holmes had a brother who was even more intelligent, more driven, and more neurotic than he was. Sherlock Holmes ended up helping him out on a few different occasions regarding cases. I determined that Agnew must be like Mycroft to Mr. Prow. If things were that strained between them, I can see why he wouldn't want to talk about it, which was sad because I am an only child. If I had a brother or sister, I would make sure I got along with them, no matter what they were like. We arrived in Paris with little fanfare and great anticipation. Mr. Prow was at least enough of a romantic to allow us to take the train, which was a perfectly wonderful way to travel. We were able to see all of the buildings, alleys, and city dwellers moving all together in a cohesive mob. It was simply stunning to behold. The old age of the place, mixed with in among the monuments, still somehow kept an urgent sense of the now. Maybe I'd seen too many movies, but I could feel something magical in the air as we arrived. Mr. Prow didn't want to use a travel pod. We rented another travel pod and tried to lure in our muffin mogul to take the bait. This time we eventually hired a security consultant to work with us to track them back to their home base. This time, we learned from our mistakes. We had everything ready. It still didn't do any good. We didn't get a single hit. Mr. Prow nearly cursed. I could hear him start many words, but close his mouth before he completed them. It was kind of sad, really. Still, his loss was my gain. I don't care what they say about Parisians. They are lovely people, and it was a lovely city. It is true that they didn't really know I was an American. I kept to myself, and as I am wont to do, and merely moved from place to place. As I examined all the French bakeries that I could find, I sampled nothing but by taste. It was a potpourri of smells. Each bakery had a different smell to it. They also all had their own feel. Some were large, some were small, some were teeming when bustling with people, some were almost empty. It was at one of the more full bakeries that I saw some of the travel pods with trays of muffin above its short, squat, and flat head. I decided to follow it. In some ways, I thought it was foolish, since there was no physical money trail to follow, and once they had sold their muffins, they just shut down and returned to the garage. But it was something productive to do, and I was in a whimsical mood. It just traveled from place to place selling muffins. I was about to give up and go back to Mr. Prow and Darla when it finally did something strange. It stopped and talked to another travel pod that was selling the muffins. They both spoke in French, but it was badly accented. I had learned to listen to the way people speak while working at the jewelry counter at Hacks. Unfortunately, I didn't know French, though I knew Darla did. I quickly pulled out my cell phone and called myself. Once I heard the voicemail message, I moved over to the pods so that I could record what they were talking about. I looked up Darla later and played it back to her. Unfortunately, I hadn't realized you can't call your own phone on a cell phone. The recording I had thought was voicemail was in fact me playing my saved voice messages on voicemail. Mr. Prow said, "I have an idea." "What?" Darla looked up something in the computer. "We can figure out what the cell towers he was using. By using those, we can look in all the other nearby cell phone towers for travel pods that are using them and match it with the data from Amberlove's phone." I looked at Darla. "Will that work?" She smiled. "Yes and no. He's on the right track, though. I can use the information to find which traffic areas the Muffin Conspiracy travel pods went to. It took a lot of daylight we had left, and well into the night, but we were finally able to get information to isolate some of the travel pods being used. With a little bit of luck and a lot of bribery to the rightful owners, we put monitors on all four of them. We indeed did get lucky the third time. The Muffinists used 2 of the same 4 travel pods another day in a row. Darla and the consultant, Sten, had been working very hard to track down all the places that had bounced their signal. The Muffinists threw a few false starts, but Sten ran some search programs that let them pick up the trail in each domain where they lost the scent. Eventually, Darla and Sten were able to track it to a cluster of computers in the Grand Caymans. At first, Darla thought this was a dead end or an attempt to throw them off the scent, but Sten showed us, particularly Mr. Prow, a series of readouts and reports that gave him 95% assurances that this was the place they were originating from. Mr. Prow was convinced. That was enough for a decision to be made. We all loaded ourselves up and boarded Prow's plane back in England to the Grand Cayman Islands. The Caymans were very pleasant. The airport was very small and quaint, and I could see major airliners from 2 or 3 carriers, at least with a dozen small jets. The map said that there was another smaller airport in the north. The travel pods were very visible when they went into the town. I thought that Prague was a hotspot for them, but they seemed to be as many travel pods as there were people. A few of them were even armed with guns. When Mr. Prow asked the local for more details, they seemed to make him nervous for some reason. The locals explained, "Oh, that's just the police. Sometimes they use them to cover more ground at a time. Most of the stores in the central markets are more pedestrian-oriented than they are car-friendly. Besides, the mayor's brother owns the local travel pod company." That certainly explained a lot. We got in a taxi and headed over to the location that Sten told us housed the controller for the travel pod. We went about 5 to 10 minutes outside the small downtown area until we came to a corporate office industrial park. After navigating several private asphalt roads, we found the right building number and the right office suite. The building said Travel Co. on one side, and then we just sat there. We sat in silence for about 5 minutes when Darla asked, "So what now, dear?" Mr. Prow didn't reply. Finally, Darla had had enough. "Unless you have a better plan, I'm just going to go ask them about the muffins." You could tell just by looking at Mr. Prow that he wanted to say something. I imagine he wanted to say something like, "Are you crazy, woman? Why alert the demons when we don't have to?" But he didn't. He would have before he had been married. Darla smiled, waited for a moment, then stood up and got out of the car. I didn't immediately know what to do in this case, but very quickly I decided that the best course of action was to go with Darla. I gave Mr. Prow a look of apology, opened the car door, and got out. I was about 3 minutes behind Darla. By the time I got there, I was able to see Darla moving further into the building past the receptionist. Darla looked back at me, smiled, and waved me on. She looked at the receptionist. "She's with me." We walked about 10 yards, turned right at a funky fake plant, and then turned left with a shiny glass window. A man inside had a bright orange hair that couldn't decide to be blonde or red. He had the blackest eyes I'd ever seen. The iris was such a dark brown that I couldn't distinguish it from the pupil. Even the whites of his eyes somehow seemed stained by shadow. He was dressed in the height of business fashion, and he stood and smiled at us with a surprisingly pleasant voice and said, "I understand you have some questions about our travel pods." Darla nodded and sat to herself across with him without any invitation. Sort of. She crossed her legs and beamed at him demurely. She was wearing a white shirt with a sky blue skirt. She was being friendly in a way that wasn't really flirtatious, but the arrogant mind might think she was being such. "I'm actually here about the muffins." "Muffins?" "Yes, the muffins." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." When he wasn't making quick glances at her chest, he was making them at mine. The muffins your travel pods are selling all over Europe." He smiled. It was the kind of smirk a 9-year-old made when they've been caught but thought themselves quite clever. "Oh, those muffins. What about them?" "Why are you selling them?" she asked. "I don't see what business it is of yours." "Oh," she shifted back and folded her hands on her skirt, smoothing it. "Well, it isn't, but we're most curious about them." "I'm afraid that I will not be able to satisfy your curiosity. My husband is particularly fascinated by them." "That's nice." He started to reach for a button to call security or his secretary or whatever. "He thinks they're demon spawn," Darla said. "I'm sorry for your husband's lack of sanity." He pressed the button. "Most people think that. Well, I'm fairly certain that they are not demon spawn. You have gone to a great deal of trouble. I can't help but feeling you've got something to hide, something you want hidden." He said, "Whom do I have the pleasure of addressing?" Darla replied, "Darla Prow. My husband is the one who noticed the unusual behavior of the children selling said muffins." Darla was not really easily deflected once she was focused on a task. She could be stubborn when she wanted to be. "And he is?" "Quiescence Prow." "Ah, yes. I've heard of him." He leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Have you?" Darla sounded surprised. "Oh, yes. He does excellent work. I've heard about him and about that business in Alaska." He thrummed his fingers on the desk. I couldn't help but ask, "What was that, the business involving the past time viewer or the depleted uranium pottery?" Someone had to represent Chester's interest, after all. He said, "Both, actually. Indeed, his work is, in large part, our work." Darla seemed very close all of a sudden. The topic had taken her entirely surprised. "What do you mean?" The man behind the chair smiled. "Mr. Prow has shown amazing intuition in solving certain kinds of problems that happen to have a very interesting application in their usage." "Huh?" I didn't get that. The work he had with the robot and mimetics showed the potential synergy that demonstrates amazing marketing applications, among other things. He pointed to the wall and some kind of diagnostic table that showed a bar with 3 big lines merging into it. You can't do meme manipulation if you're not narcoleptic. I should know. I had to take enough pills to feed an army every morning, same as Darla. If I had to do it to save the world, fine, but otherwise, he shook his head. I'm afraid you're quite wrong. We've made some rather astonishing deliverables, and now we've discovered how meme syncs do what they do. I was shocked. You mean there's no reason for me to delay the treatment anymore? He laughed, shaking his head. Oh no. The world isn't ready for 100,000 new messiahs, each swaying the world to their most recent cause. Darla started to get mad now. So what you're saying is that you don't want competition for your new marketing techniques. He laughed and shook his head. No, you're misunderstanding me. These techniques are going to be used to help people. The right people, Darla said, her voice rising. That's right, but other people as well. Have you ever had narcolepsy? Darla sneered. The man ignored her outrage and continued talking. Have you ever felt what it was like to be under the effects of one of your memes? I couldn't help but giggle at that. Poor Chester. The man looked at me and nodded. Exactly. This kind of technology in the wrong hands could do tremendous damage. Darla slammed both of her fists on the desk, and so that everything on top of it shook and scattered, creating minor chaos in its wake. I am not technology. We gave up a lot to keep people from using this manipulation thing. If you're just going to use those memes to sell cereal, then you can forget it. He raised his hands defensively. I didn't say you couldn't have the surgery, Mrs. Prow. I just said this technology could do damage in the wrong hands. Darla was not so easily mollified. You just said that 100,000 reversed mimetics would be bad, and that is true. However, in a few rare cases, where the person is quite responsible and can be trusted, it seems that since we do not yet understand how the surgery works, if a technological inhibitor of some kind were created, then that person could lead a perfectly normal life, so long as they chose to wear it. Darla was ready for an immediate comeback, but she stopped and thought about it. I couldn't blame her. I'm narcoleptic too, and the idea of being able to live my life again without taking drugs every day, just to be able to stay upright while I laughed or stay awake when things got boring, was an appealing one. I could easily imagine Darla asking the next question of who decides who is responsible when Quiescence Prow began making a huge racket outside. 2 or 3 security guards were attempting to restrain him, while he held them back with some kind of bizarre improvised pike, which had a taser taped on each end. Mr. Prow thought he was in a Star Wars film, apparently. Mr. Prow shouted at the top of his lungs, Take me to the demon children, lest I smite you all! I had always known that Mr. Prow was a bit eccentric, but I'd never seen him this worked up. Indeed, now that I thought about it, I'd never seen anyone that worked up. The man Darla had been talking to laughed and waved the guards away from Mr. Prow. I think I can take it from here. I believe I can solve the problem that is troubling you, Mr. Prow. If you and your 2 companions will follow me, I will demonstrate demon children to both of you. Mr. Prow stopped, smiled, and enabled a complete change of demeanor. He became gentilities personified. Why, I do believe that would do just fine. And so it was that the 4 of us moved down an elevator and went to a basement 4 floors below street level. It was at this point that I realized that we still did not know the man's name, but since no one had asked it or was asking it, I didn't want to be rude. The chamber we walked into was vast, with hundreds of monitors on every side of the room. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I came to understand that it was a hollowed-out cavern. The monitors were ringed around some of the largest stalagmites and stalactites I'd ever seen. Our host turned to us and said, Welcome to the nest. Each of the children you saw trying to sell muffins on travel pods was born here. Here is where they communicate with each other. Here is where they lived. They chattered away from one box to another. Looking at each screen, it became apparent that they existed in some kind of virtual environment. I could see little bits of buildings behind them as they moved around, but you could see the same parts on each of the screens. The man said, They know what they are. They each started out as a simulation. But with insights gained from the self-aware robot, combined with the algorithms we gained from our mimetic studies, we have gained a far greater understanding of how humans act and think. We are working on reverse engineering the process to gain a greater understanding of individual intelligence, but we're not quite there yet. Mr. Prow looked at the screens. So they're artificially intelligent? Yes and no. They're quite intelligent, light years ahead of any other autonomous software package out there. But they don't understand the do not underestimate the sophistication of the human mind. Individually, they're not much smarter in some ways than a clever bird. Of course, intelligence is relative. Most people are on autopilot most of the time, so they never even come close to realizing, Darla smirked. So you've gone to all this trouble to create a glorified spam bots? Yes and no. Spam bots did actually advance certain levels of heuristic considerably, and while we have been testing them somewhat in a marketing capacity, it is actually for a good cause. He waved his hand at the monitors. All at once, all the chattering children stopped talking while our host continued. They have, however, been able to mimic the behavior of a group of people almost perfectly, at least mathematically speaking. The equations are hideously complex, but they essentially boil down to the fact that Isaac Asimov's vision of histomathematics is possible. Histo what? I asked. He smiled. I won't bore you with the details, but basically Asimov postulated that while mathematically predicting the behavior of an individual is virtually impossible, it was possible to predict large groups. He was right, Darla asked. And what have you learned? Our host smiled. Quite a bit. Most of which I'm not at liberty to say, but let us simply hint that, unless changed, things look rather dire down the road. Prowl snarled. I could have told you that. What concerns me is how you intend to use this mimetic technology. Be assured, until we understand how to defend against it, we don't dare use it. We can't all be meme sinks, after all. Darla said, You're lying, I can tell. Ah, Mrs. Prow, you're quite the student of human nature and expression. There is one very limited application of mimetic activity we felt safe trying. And what is that? Prowl asked. Why? The meme for secrecy, of course. I hate to break it to you, Darla smiled, but you weren't able to keep this place as secret as you thought. Mr. Prow nodded. I have taken numerous precautions should anyone attempt to disappear me, our host chuckled. He sat down by one side of the nearby monitors and explained his position. He frequently moved his hands as he did so. This isn't a question of security, Mr. Prow, but of secrecy. I would like to add that it took the three of you considerable effort with extensive resources at your command. Even then, all you were able to do is find the location of our facility. Darla said, We already know all about what you're doing with the virtual children. You're assuming that that is what we're keeping secret. Innocence sells, and it sells quite well. But we won't need any special mimetic technique to make it work. All we will need is a very cute face and a product image that doesn't push people away. You'll never get away with it, Prowl shouted. He stood tall and triumphant, the wind from a nearby vent causing his trench coat to flutter and a deerstalker cap to fly up his skull, exposing the poorly placed bald cap underneath. One could still see his hair. Our host asked quietly, Get away with what? Mr. Prow, having expected a vehement denial, With the thing you're keeping secret! You are the most chaotic and unreadable person, Mr. Quiescence Prow. How could you take a simple conversation about child innocence and turn it into a statement about a secret you know nothing about? Darla said, Because we want to know what the secret is, not falling so easily into his trap. We want to know what you are risking mimetic contamination of the world to hide. He smiled. Why? Whatever we wish, of course. And as a test case, we have been remarkably successful. He was giving me a headache. I just said, What are you keeping secret? The fact that I have kept you obsessed over the secret itself, that you haven't even asked questions remotely related to the true puzzle. By keeping it obvious, we have hidden it in plain sight. Thus, we have succeeded with our first field test, but I think they will be successful as well. I wish if we could affect you, especially two meme sinks. We can affect anyone we wish. Never! Prowl shouted, collapsing to the floor, holding his hands over his forehead. You will never affect me with your vile, toxic memes. Never. Our host said, I already have. I couldn't stand it anymore. What the hell do you mean? He pushed a button on his wall, and as the door opened, why my name? It ain't Rumpelstiltskin, I'll give you that much. He stepped through the door and the wall, which rapidly closed behind him. Mr. Prow pounded the door in anger and frustration. Darla tried to find a way out. I was the one who noticed the unusual smell. Unfortunately, I took a deep breath of it, trying to determine what it was. When I woke up, I saw Mr. Prow and Darla sleeping next to me. We were right next to our rental car. I woke up. Mr. Prow cursed a blue streak. I'd never heard him use language like that before. Darla seemed just about as surprised as I was. Well, that tears it, Mr. Prow said. I have to get Watson back now. We've got to find out what these people are up to. Darla didn't look happy about that, but she didn't say anything. I think she wanted to bide her time and find out exactly what Mr. Prow was up to and then tell him how stupid it was, even though I could tell by her expression that the real reason she objected was that it involved getting Chester out of jail. Then again, in retrospect, it was a pretty stupid plan after all.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com. contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Well. First of all, if you've never heard this before, welcome to the secret commentary at the end of the bumper for every chapter in this novel. Where to start? Okay, so I think let's start with the positive. Some things in this chapter really sing. The different perspective of Amberlove compared to Chester, I got spot on. This was the first novel I wrote from a first-person perspective. In fact, as I recall, I believe it is the only one I've written from a first-person perspective, and it can be difficult to write two different voices in the same novel, and Amberlove definitely comes across as Amberlove in this chapter. I think the other thing that I think works really well in this chapter are the way it syncs to the previous chapter, where you have lots of seemingly innocuous details, like, one technology over here and another technology over here, and they kind of come together, and that part does come out really well in this chapter. I actually surprisingly get some of the details of the feel of Paris right, where, considering I'd never been to Paris, and I do like some of the smaller details I have in Prague as well. Yeah, that's about it. So let's start with the negative, because obviously that's the more fun part of the commentary, and probably why you're listening to this. If you are listening to this, which I really honestly doubt. If there were rails in the first 6 chapters, this chapter, they go completely off the rails. The idea that Michael Onyx, who is the name of the character who is actually not named in this chapter, who is the only real character in both the first and second novel that is a shared component, does not work. It is a neat idea that, and it's not even clear in the chapter, so to clarify, the idea is that they've harnessed the memes being distributed by the little virtual children chatbots to make it so that secrecy is a thing that they can distribute, which for a conspiracy is a 101 really smart idea, is not executed well. Mainly because at one point, there's only at one point where Amberlove actually says, we haven't asked this guy for his name. We should do that. There should at least be one other, right, instance of Chekhov's shotgun over the wall if you're going to go that route, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but the execution was lacking. The biggest issue with this chapter is it's just too fucking long. I've had at least 2 different people edit this, and neither ever said, you know what, take this chapter and take out 20% of the words. As I was reading it, I was like, holy fuck, this thing is just way, way, way too long. Another problem with the chapter is that at the end of the day, what inspired me to write it was I see all of these novels in the literature section of the bookstore. Some of them are sci-fi. You know, you'll see urban fantasy in the literature section. And by my estimate then, and I still stand by that estimate, the line about who gets into the official literature section of the bookstore versus people that are resigned to the young adult or sci-fi / fantasy or gaming fiction is largely who you are, and that's therefore largely who you know, and therefore completely fucking arbitrary. And I stand by that assessment / observation. It basically has to do with what your agent thinks about you, what your publishing house thinks about you, or how you just generically sell it. Probably to a certain degree, therefore, how you think about yourself. And I was trying to do that with this novel. Even though it is science fiction, it was an attempt to do more mainstream science fiction versus the completely woo-woo out there time travel, hardcore sci-fi / electro science, you know, fantasy, robot fantasy thing, whatever, that I did in the first novel. This one was an attempt to be a little more grounded, and Jesus Christ, it is anything but. But I think if I had to do literature now, I would be a hell of a lot better at it than I was 15, 16 years ago. One of my favorite anecdotes just in general, but also about Star Wars, involves how the cantina music scene, in case you don't remember, it's you know, if you've seen Star Wars, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the most distinctive musical piece in John Williams' score, which every single piece of it is absolutely fantastic. And you know, John Williams at one point went to Lucas and said, you know, how do you want me to do this? And Lucas said, I want you to imagine that someone took Gershwin and buried it, and a bunch of aliens came back 2,000 to 3,000 years later, dug it up, and tried to play it. And it sounds like that. That's exactly how it sounds. And in my case, it's as if I had read Tom Clancy or John, you know, a mainstream popular author, buried it, come from an alien culture, and tried to create literature. And it feels like literature. Just the little things, you know, the details. It's kind of stuck somewhere between science fiction and literature, and it does neither well. You know, the muffins thing is cute. If I was ever to edit this or try and rewrite it as it is, as compared to, you know, inspired by, which will very likely be the case. I think that I might keep the muffins detail because you know, like I said, the small weird details are one of the cuter things about this novel, but the execution is just so terrible that it just doesn't work. I think another example is everything in this novel in particular, more than any other novel I write, feels stale. And by stale, I mean not alive. So George Lucas is one of my favorite directors and producers and technologists and futurists of all time. But every artist, no matter how good, has at least one, sometimes many fatal flaws. And in Lucas's case, he has quite a few. But the biggest, most glaring one is Lucas is really, frankly, just not comfortable with people. Even when he produces a work that does have fantastic acting in spite of his direction, or does have fantastic casting in spite of his, you know, influence, as we see in Phantom Menace. You know, Phantom Menace is an example of what we would have had in the original Star Wars movies if somebody had not been able to tell Lucas no. Phantom Menace has some of the most fantastic actors of all time. You know, Liam Neeson, Natalie Portman. And they are deliberately told to act in a wooden and lifeless manner to represent the corruption of the old republic, which is just stupid. And at the time that I wrote this, I did not understand people well. I was different. I was weird. I still am obviously different and weird, but I at least understand 15 years later a little bit better about what makes people tick. And, you know, had I stuck to the Jack London style of one guy and a wolf in the middle of fucking nowhere, this novel might have rocked on toast. Or a post-apocalyptic wasteland where, you know, you've got 5 or 6 people. The 5 or 6 people who are named are pretty good. You know, they're not perfect, but the characterization is approaching what it should be. Instead, it feels like, you know, you got a video game with modern 4K, richly textured graphics for our 3 protagonist characters, and then maybe a generation behind for Michael Onyx, and then every other character is basically 8-bit graphics, right? It is just... The crowds aren't even there. There's no detail. Like, it does. Like, I describe Prague and Paris moderately well, but there's no people there. These are blank, uninhabited cities that are parodies of the real thing. And I've, over time, continuing to do this, gotten better at that. But I think in general, the biggest fix that this would need is it just needs to be about 1,000 to 1,500 words shorter.